They came with the cross upon their chests and blood upon their hands. History calls them knights. The church called them warriors of God. But the survivors, those who witnessed it with their own eyes, called them by another name: monsters. In 1099, when the Crusaders entered Jerusalem, blood ran ankle-deep on the horses. Not a metaphor. Those are the words of the soldiers themselves. Men, women, children, the elderly, no one was spared. And that was not even the worst of it. There was a commander who ordered an entire city of 20,000 put to the sword, simply because he could not tell enemy from civilian. His solution? Kill them all. God will recognize his own. There was a prince who shattered a peace treaty and attacked an unarmed pilgrim caravan for nothing more than gold. There was a king celebrated by history as a hero who ordered 2,700 prisoners beheaded in front of their families. In today's video, we pull back the curtain on the pages of history hidden behind the glory of the Crusades and meet 10 men whose brutality surpasses any villain in legend. Make sure you watch until the end, because the man at number 1 will leave you unable to believe this is real. Chapter 1. Raynald de Châtillon. If the Crusades produced one man who made even his allies shudder, it was Raynald de Châtillon. He was not royalty, nor of any distinguished noble lineage. Raynald was merely a mid-ranking knight from the region of Châtillon-sur-Loing in France, who arrived in the Holy Land with nothing but empty hands and bottomless ambition. Yet through cunning, violence, and a recklessness bordering on madness, he clawed his way to the summit of crusader power, only to drag that entire kingdom down into the abyss with him. Raynald arrived in Antioch around 1153 in the wake of the Second Crusade's catastrophic failure. Thanks to his striking appearance and silver tongue, he quickly caught the eye of Constance, Princess of Antioch, a recent widow who held sovereign rule over one of the most strategically vital territories in the Holy Land. In 1153, the two were married. Overnight, the obscure knight became Prince of Antioch. Power came to him, and Raynald immediately showed the world his true nature. The first conflict erupted with Amaury de Limoges, the Patriarch of Antioch, who refused to provide funds for Raynald's planned military campaign against the island of Cyprus. For another man, this would have been an ordinary political disagreement. For Raynald, it was an insult that demanded a blood price. He had the Patriarch Amaury seized, stripped naked, beaten savagely, and then had honey smeared across the still bleeding wounds. He then ordered the old man bound to a rooftop and left exposed to the Middle Eastern summer sun for hours, with flies swarming over his body. This was not torture to extract information. This was a pure display of power, a message sent to everyone who might dare defy Raynald de Châtillon. No one in Antioch spoke out. The Patriarch was eventually released, but the incident spread across the Crusader kingdom like a chilling warning. In 1156, having failed to extract money from the Patriarch, Raynald turned to another source of funding, King Baldwin III of Jerusalem. The king also refused. Raynald was undeterred. He resolved to finance himself in the simplest way possible: plunder. The target was Cyprus, at that time a territory of the Byzantine Empire, a nominal ally of the Crusader states. Raynald allied with Thoros II, an Armenian warlord, and led his forces across the sea to storm the island with no justification whatsoever beyond greed. What unfolded on Cyprus over the following weeks is one of the darkest chapters of the Crusades. Raynald's men ravaged cities, looted monasteries, massacred civilians, and tortured Byzantine Christian clergy. Note carefully, those killed were not Muslims, not enemies of the cross. They were Byzantine Christians, people who were, in theory, co-religionists of Raynald. He ordered the noses and ears of monks cut off, had clergymen tortured, then had pine tar smeared over their heads, and left them under the blazing sun. A method of torment eerily similar to what he had done to Patriarch Amaury. The Cyprus raid produced catastrophic diplomatic consequences. Byzantine Emperor Manuel I erupted in fury, immediately withdrew all support for the Crusader states, and threatened military reprisal. King Baldwin III of Jerusalem was forced to personally apologize to the Byzantine emperor, practically prostrating himself in supplication. The entire intricate alliance system the Crusader states had painstakingly constructed was dismantled by Raynald in a matter of weeks, for the sake of greed. Yet the direct consequences for Raynald himself were almost negligible. That was part of why he kept escalating. In 1160, Raynald led a raid into the territory of Nur ad-Din, the powerful Muslim sultan who controlled Syria. This time, fortune no longer favored him. Nur ad-Din's forces counterattacked, captured Raynald alive, and marched him to Aleppo. He was thrown into the dungeons of Aleppo and remained there for 16 years. 16 years is time enough for most people to reflect on the course of their lives. Long enough to change. Long enough to recognize that there are lines that should never be crossed. But for Raynald, 16 years in darkness only made him more deranged and more dangerous. In 1176, he was ransomed and freed. Stepping out of captivity at nearly 60 years of age, Raynald quickly married Stephanie de Milly, a wealthy widow who controlled the Transjordan lordship, including the fortress of Carac and the castle of Montreal. The position was of extreme strategic importance. Sitting astride the trade routes linking Egypt to Syria, Raynald's domain could control, or sever, the entire commercial artery of the Islamic world. Raynald understood this perfectly, and he knew exactly what he intended to do with that power. Throughout the 12th century, the Crusader states and the surrounding Islamic world regularly concluded short-term truces. These arrangements existed not out of mutual affection, but because perpetual warfare served no one's interests. Saladin, the rising sultan in the process of unifying the Islamic world, regarded these agreements as essential foundations upon which to build his strength before the final reckoning. Raynald regarded these truce agreements as worthless scraps of paper, fit only for burning. In 1181, while the truce was still in force, Raynald unleashed his men against a Muslim pilgrim caravan passing through his territory. The caravan was unarmed, not a military force. These were ordinary people making the pilgrimage to Mecca as they had done for years. Raynald plundered their goods and seized the entire party as hostages. Saladin furiously dispatched envoys to Jerusalem, demanding the prisoners' release and compensation. King Baldwin IV, a shrewd ruler despite suffering from leprosy, agreed and ordered Raynald to free the hostages. Raynald ignored the order entirely. But that was not even his most catastrophic act. In 1182, Raynald did something that even by the blood-soaked standards of the crusading era was considered a transgression beyond all limits. He assembled a small fleet and launched an attack into the Red Sea, waters that Muslims regarded as sacrosanct and inviolable. His ships struck Islamic merchant vessels, landed raiding parties on the Arabian coastline, and, most dangerously of all, drew close to Jeddah, the port city of Mecca, threatening Medina, one of the two holiest cities in all of Islam. This was the equivalent of someone attacking the Vatican in the Christian world, multiplied tenfold. For hundreds of millions of Muslims across the world, this was not merely a military act. It was an unforgivable desecration. Saladin swore before Allah that he would kill Raynald with his own hands. King Baldwin IV died in 1185, leaving behind a kingdom in its death throes and a 4-year truce with Saladin, the most significant agreement ever concluded between the two sides. Both parties needed time to consolidate. It was the last opportunity to preserve the fragile equilibrium of the Holy Land. In 1187, Raynald destroyed that agreement for the final and most decisive time. Another Muslim pilgrim caravan, large and wealthy, was traveling through Raynald's Transjordan territory. On this occasion, the truce was more explicit than ever, containing clear provisions guaranteeing safe passage for civilians. Saladin had even proactively notified the Crusader side about the caravan's movement to prevent any misunderstanding. Raynald attacked. He plundered everything. He seized all travelers as hostages, and when Saladin's envoys arrived to protest, Raynald declared outright that he recognized no agreement and would do whatever he pleased within his own lands. Saladin had no reason left to wait. The summer of 1187 was one of the hottest the Middle East had ever recorded. Saladin mobilized a great army and marched against the Crusader states, more than 20,000 elite cavalry and infantry. The Crusader forces, under the command of King Guy of Lusignan, committed a fatal strategic blunder. They abandoned a well-watered defensive position and marched across open desert to relieve the besieged city of Tiberias. Precisely the bait Saladin had laid. In the appalling heat, without water, the Crusader army was exhausted and driven into a corner at the horns of Hauteville, within sight of the Sea of Galilee, a shoreline they could never reach. Raynald was present at this battle, not as a hero, but as one of the men most directly responsible for dragging the entire kingdom into catastrophe. It was his actions that had compelled Saladin to march, his violations that had stripped away every last diplomatic option. At Hauteville, the Crusader army was annihilated. Nearly 20,000 men were killed or enslaved. The entire knightly strength of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was erased in a single day. 3 months later, Jerusalem fell, with no army left to defend it. After Hauteville, Raynald was captured alive alongside King Guy of Lusignan and a host of other Crusader nobles. Saladin had a tent erected to receive the high-ranking prisoners, following the custom befitting a civilized commander. What happened next was recorded by numerous contemporary historians on both sides, and the accounts are substantially consistent. Saladin entered the tent and found Guy of Lusignan trembling with fear and parched with thirst. He offered the king a cup of cold water, in accordance with the Arab custom that one who offers an enemy food or drink is thereafter bound not to kill them. Guy drank, then passed the cup to Raynald standing beside him. Saladin immediately said through his interpreter, "Tell him that it is not I who gave him water. He does not enjoy my protection." Saladin then turned to Raynald and enumerated his crimes one by one. The attacks on pilgrim caravans, the broken truces, the threats against the holy cities. He asked whether Raynald had anything to say. Raynald expressed no remorse. By all accounts, he remained defiant, saying that he had only done what princes had always done. Saladin drew his sword and struck Raynald across the shoulder himself. The guards surrounding them finished the kill. This was deeply extraordinary. In both the Crusader world and the Islamic world, high-ranking noble prisoners were customarily kept alive for ransom, an enormously important source of revenue in wartime. Saladin surrendered the vast ransom he could have collected from Raynald simply to honor the oath he had sworn years before. That tells you everything about what Raynald de Châtillon had done, and what it could not be bought away from. Raynald de Châtillon died in July 1187, but the consequences of his actions echoed long afterward. The fall of Jerusalem in October 1187 triggered the Third Crusade, one of the most costly and blood-soaked conflicts in medieval European history. Hundreds of thousands perished in the decades that followed, in part because of the chain of events Raynald had set in motion through his greed and brutality. There is a historical irony worth noting. Raynald de Châtillon never considered himself a villain. In his own mind, he was simply a strong man taking what was rightfully his, defending the Christian kingdom, showing no fear before his enemies. That is precisely what made him more dangerous than any villain who is conscious of their own evil. It is those who are utterly convinced of their own righteousness who are the most dangerous of all. Chapter 2. Simon de Montfort. Some men kill for greed, some kill out of hatred, but Simon de Montfort killed for faith, and that is what made him more dangerous than all the rest. When a man believes God stands at his side, no boundary remains. Simon de Montfort was born around 1165 at Montfort-l'Amaury in the Île-de-France region of France. He came from a middling noble family, not wealthy, but enough to ensure an education and military training from childhood. From an early age, Simon was known for an iron will, deep piety, and an ambition no less formidable. He joined the Fourth Crusade in 1202, but abandoned the campaign when he discovered its true objective was not the liberation of Jerusalem, but the sacking of Christian cities along the Adriatic coast at the behest of Venetian financiers. Simon de Montfort refused to take part in the slaughter of fellow Christians. He withdrew his forces and returned to France. This sounds like an act of conscience, and in truth it was. The trouble is that Simon de Montfort had a very precise boundary in his mind. He would not kill Orthodox Christians. Christians he deemed heretical, apostates, dissenters, were an entirely different matter. To understand what Simon de Montfort did, one must understand who his victims were. In the early 13th century, southern France, the Languedoc in particular, was flourishing with a religious movement known as Catharism. The Cathars held a theology utterly unlike that of Roman Catholicism. They believed the material world was the creation of an evil god, while the human soul belonged to a pure spiritual realm. They rejected the authority of the Roman Church, refused its sacraments, and denied the Pope's jurisdiction. The Cathars lived simply. Many were genuinely devout and peaceable people. They did not preach violence, did not rise against the state, did not threaten anyone. They merely held a different theology. But for Pope Innocent III, the very existence of the Cathars was an existential threat to the power of the Catholic Church. If the movement spread, Rome's authority would crumble. In 1208, a papal legate was assassinated in southern France. The true culprit never established, and Innocent III immediately proclaimed a crusade against the Cathars and the lords who sheltered them. This was the first time in history that a crusade was launched not against Muslims, but against European Christians, and the man chosen to lead it was Simon de Montfort. In the summer of 1209, an enormous army of some 20,000 men assembled at Lyon, knights and mercenaries drawn largely from northern France. They marched south bearing enticing promises from the Pope. All sins would be absolved, and more particularly, any land seized from lords who harbored Cathars would belong to whoever took it. This was not merely a religious war. It was an opportunity for the northern nobility to plunder the wealthy lands of the south under the banner of faith. The first target was the city of Béziers, a prosperous trading center in the Languedoc with a population of roughly 10 to 15,000. The city was home to both Cathar and Catholic communities who had lived alongside one another for decades without significant conflict. Before the army arrived, papal envoys had drawn up a list of approximately 220 prominent Cathars within the city and demanded that the people of Béziers surrender these individuals for trial. The people of Béziers refused, not because they were all Cathars. In fact, the majority of the population was Catholic. They refused because the Cathars within their walls were neighbors, friends, and family, and they could not conceive of what that refusal would bring. The Crusader army arrived and surrounded Béziers. Strangely, no immediate assault had been planned. While the commanders were still debating strategy, a group of mercenaries in the lower ranks of the army, known as rebauds, the undisciplined rabble at the bottom of the military hierarchy, launched a spontaneous attack on the city gates. These were men without discipline, without organization, armed with nothing more than crude weapons. But the city's defenders made a fatal error. They opened the gates to mount a counterattack, and the rebauds poured in. Moments later, the entire army flooded through behind them. What happened next unfolded over the course of a few hours. The people of Béziers fled into churches, seeking sanctuary, trusting that sacred ground would protect them. The Cathars ran to the church of Saint Nazaire. The Catholics ran to the church of La Madeleine. Both crowds knelt in prayer, certain that men wearing the cross on their chests would not kill people inside the house of God. They were wrong. The Crusader forces broke down the doors of both churches and slaughtered everyone inside without distinction. The entire city was then burned to prevent plague from the mass of corpses. Amid the chaos of the massacre, an officer ran to Arnaud Amaury, the papal legate who served as the direct representative of the Pope and the spiritual commander of the entire campaign, and asked how they were to distinguish Cathars from Catholics in the frenzied crowd. Arnaud Amaury replied in Latin, "Cadite eos, novit enim dominus qui sunt eos." Kill them all, God will recognize his own. This line was first recorded by the monk Caesarius of Heisterbach roughly 20 years after the event, and some modern historians have questioned its exact authenticity. But even if those precise words were never spoken, the reality on the ground was unambiguous. No one in Béziers was asked whether they were Cathar or Catholic before being killed. Arnaud Amaury subsequently wrote to Rome himself to report the victory to the Pope, proudly informing him that nearly 20,000 had been put to the sword, without distinction of age or sex. This figure came from his own triumphant letter, not from an enemy's account. Simon de Montfort did not personally issue the orders that day, since the killing broke out beyond the original plan, but he was the commander of the entire campaign, and he took no action to halt or punish what had happened. More significantly, in every subsequent campaign that he directly led, the pattern of brutality was repeated in a far more systematic and deliberate fashion. After Béziers, the army advanced on Carcassonne, a city far more heavily fortified. This time there was no massacre, as the city surrendered after its water supply was cut off. The Lord of Carcassonne, Viscount Raymond Roger Trencavel, came to the Crusader camp to negotiate and was immediately seized, a flagrant violation of the terms of parley. Raymond Roger Trencavel died in captivity a few months later. Simon de Montfort took possession of Carcassonne and assumed the title of Viscount for himself. It was at this moment that Simon de Montfort's true nature became fully apparent. He was not merely a soldier executing the Pope's orders. He was a conqueror building his own empire under the guise of faith. In the years that followed, Simon led a succession of campaigns that laid waste to southern France. At each city taken, he applied the same consistent formula. Anyone captured as a Cathar or found to have sheltered Cathars would be burned alive. No real trial, no weighing of evidence. An accusation alone was sufficient. In 1210, Simon besieged Minerve, a small fortress perched on sheer cliffs in the Languedoc. After weeks of complete isolation and the cutting of its water supply, Minerve surrendered. Arnaud Amaury, still accompanying the army as the Pope's spiritual representative, agreed to spare the lives of the Catholics in the city and of any Cathars willing to renounce their faith. This sounds, on the surface, like an act of mercy. It was not. 140 Cathars in Minerve, among them women known as bons chrétiens, the good Christians, refused to step forward and declare an abjuration. They knew what awaited them and chose death over the denial of what they believed. Simon de Montfort ordered a great pyre built and drove all 140 people into the flames. According to an eyewitness account from within the Crusader army, the Cathars did not need to be driven. They walked into the fire themselves without compulsion. Simon was said to have watched the scene with an expressionless face. For him, this was simply a necessary procedure. If Minerve could still be justified on theological grounds, since those who died had refused to recant, then Lavaur in 1211 admits of no justification whatsoever. Lavaur was a larger city, defended by Amaury de Montreal and his sister Giralda de Laurac, a noblewoman widely respected throughout the region. After weeks of siege, the city fell. Simon de Montfort had all 80 knights who had defended the city hanged without trial. Amaury de Montreal was thrown down a well and stoned to death by the crowd. And Giralda de Laurac, a noblewoman who had taken no part in the fighting, was thrown into a pit and buried alive. Simon then ordered all Cathars in the city and the surrounding areas assembled. 400 people were herded into an open field and burned alive in a single enormous pyre. Simon de Montfort and his officers stood and watched, not because they were required to watch, because they wanted to. What is most complex and most terrifying about Simon de Montfort is that he was not a villain in the cinematic sense. No sinister smile, no savage laugh. Those who knew him described a calm, devout man, faithful to his wife and children, of high personal discipline. He attended Mass every day. He fasted on holy days. He treated his loyal soldiers well. It was precisely that composure that was most horrifying. Simon de Montfort killed not in rage or panic. He ordered hundreds burned alive in the same manner he might order rations prepared for his army, as an administrative task to be completed. To him, the Cathars were not people. They were a stain on the body of God's church, and that stain had to be cleansed. This was not a worldview he invented himself. The Pope and the entire Catholic theological apparatus of the era had constructed the intellectual and religious foundations for it. Simon was simply its most consistent and thoroughgoing executor. By 1215, after years of campaigning, Simon de Montfort controlled much of southern France and had been recognized as its rightful lord by the Fourth Lateran Council, one of the most important ecclesiastical councils of the medieval church. He stood at the apex of his power. But the South would not submit. The local people, many of them perfectly Orthodox Catholics, could not accept being ruled by a conquering army from the north. In 1217, Count Raymond VI of Toulouse, who had been stripped of his lands and driven into exile, slipped back in secret and led a rebellion. Toulouse rose and drove Simon's forces from the city. Simon de Montfort returned to besiege Toulouse in 1218, determined to reclaim what he regarded as his. For nearly a year, the two sides ground against each other. The people of Toulouse fought with the resolve of those defending their own homes. On the 25th of June, 1218, a stone fired from a Toulouse defensive catapult struck Simon de Montfort in the head as he was inspecting his fortifications. He died instantly. According to the chronicle of Guillaume de Tudel, a local poet who had witnessed the entire war, the people of Toulouse poured into the streets in celebration when news of Simon's death spread. No one wept. No one organized prayers for his soul. There was only the jubilation of survivors. That was all he had left behind in southern France after 10 years of war. The Albigensian Crusade continued officially until 1229 and in practice until 1255. With the suppression of the Cathars extending even further through the Inquisition established in its wake. The Cathar movement was finally extinguished entirely in the early 14th century. No one knows with certainty how many died across the entire campaign that Simon de Montfort led in its opening phase. Estimates range from 200,000 to 1 million, encompassing both those killed directly by war and those who perished in the famines and epidemics that war produces. The Languedoc, one of the most prosperous and culturally sophisticated regions in Europe at the time, required decades to recover its population and economy. There is a historical question scholars still debate. Was Simon de Montfort a butcher or a product of his age? The answer is probably both. He was not the only man of his era willing to kill for faith, but he was the man who did so most systematically, most efficiently, and most without remorse. And in that, there is a chilling lesson that has lost none of its relevance. When power is granted to a man who believes his violence carries divine sanction, no limit survives. No death toll is too great. No act is too cruel. Because in his mind, all of it is the will of God. Chapter 3. Godfrey de Bouillon. There are people whom history paints as saints, statues erected in their honor, streets named after them, praised in textbooks for nearly 1,000 years. Godfrey de Bouillon is one of them. And that is precisely the problem. Because behind the magnificent monument that later generations built stands a different truth. A truth that the people living in Jerusalem in the summer of 1099 paid for with their own blood. Godfrey de Bouillon was born around 1060, the second son of Count Eustace II of Bouillon. Those who wrote his biography typically portrayed the ideal knight, brave, pious, humble. The most often told story is that after capturing Jerusalem, Godfrey refused to wear a golden crown because he would not wear a crown of gold where Jesus had worn a crown of thorns. Instead, he accepted the title Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. This story is beautiful, and it may partly be true. But what happened in the 3 days before he stood before the Holy Sepulchre and bowed his head in prayer was not beautiful at all. The First Crusade set out in 1096. Godfrey sold nearly all of his possessions to cover the costs and led some 10,000 men on the march. The journey took nearly 3 years and consumed most of those who began it, crossing the Balkans, passing through Constantinople, traversing the arid plains of Anatolia, then enduring an 8-month siege of Antioch in hunger and disease while a Muslim relief army encircled them from outside. By the time they caught sight of Jerusalem's walls in June 1099, the remaining army numbered somewhere between 12 and 15,000 soldiers, out of what may have been 70,000 at the outset. 3 years of fighting, starvation, and sickness had distilled them into a group of men who were hardened, fanatical, and in many cases, dehumanized by everything they had been forced to endure. Jerusalem at that time was under the control of Fatimid Egypt. Governor Iftikhar ad-Dawla had prepared thoroughly, stockpiling food, destroying the wells outside the walls, and expelling all Christians from the city. Inside the walls at that point were primarily Muslims and a Jewish community that had lived there across many centuries. The Crusader army arrived on June 7th. The first assault on June 13th failed completely for lack of siege equipment. The arrival of a Genoese and English fleet at the port of Jaffa, carrying building materials, salvaged the campaign. Over the following 5 weeks, the Crusaders felled timber from distant forests, hauled it back, and constructed siege towers under a punishing sun while enduring a constant rain of arrows and stones from the walls. The night before the final assault, priests organized a procession around the walls of Jerusalem. Godfrey walked barefoot as an act of penance. The soldiers witnessed this, and their spirits were lifted. They did not know that this devout act of prayer would be followed by the 2 most horrific days Jerusalem had ever witnessed. The assault began on the morning of July 14th. By late afternoon, Godfrey's tower on the northern side had pushed close enough to drop a bridge across the wall. In the early hours of July 15th, the first soldiers set foot on the walls. Godfrey was 3rd or 4th, depending on the source. Wave after wave of troops poured through. The defenses collapsed more quickly than either side had expected. Governor Iftikhar withdrew to the Tower of David and negotiated his surrender with Raymond of Toulouse, receiving a guarantee of safe passage out of the city, a promise Raymond kept. But for the civilians still inside the walls, no agreement had been offered, and none was honored. What happened on July 15th and 16th is recorded by multiple sources from the Christian, Muslim, and Jewish sides alike, and they are in broad agreement. The Crusaders poured into the city and killed, not only those bearing arms, everyone. Fulcher of Chartres, a priest who traveled with the army, described Crusaders cutting down all they encountered, in prose that made no effort to conceal its pride. Raymond of Aguilers wrote of the Temple Mount area, where many Muslims had fled for shelter. Those who went through the temple waded in blood up to their ankles. These are the words of a Christian within that very army, not of an enemy. The Jewish community fled into the city's largest synagogue. The Crusaders surrounded it and set it ablaze. Everyone inside burned to death. No record exists of any effort by Godfrey de Bouillon to halt what was happening during those 2 days. The pivotal question: how much personal responsibility did Godfrey bear? Some historians argue that he was not the sole commander. The First Crusade was a loose coalition of multiple armies under various lords, with no unified command structure. This argument has factual merit. But certain truths cannot be disputed. Godfrey was the first to breach the walls. His soldiers were the first to pour into the city from the northern sector. There is no document recording any attempt on his part to restrain or control his troops during the 2 days that followed. And afterward, he was the one who received authority over Jerusalem and enjoyed the fruits of a conquest for which no accountability was ever sought regarding what had occurred. Under both modern military principles and many medieval ethical frameworks, a commander bears responsibility for the actions of the soldiers under his command. Godfrey knew what was happening. He had the authority to order it stopped. He did not. After 2 days of massacre, Godfrey de Bouillon removed his armor, dressed in pilgrim's clothing, and walked barefoot to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to pray. He wept as he knelt before the place that, according to Christian faith, was where Jesus had been buried and had risen. This is the image that across centuries to come became the foundation of the Godfrey legend. Yet none of those who built that legend ever answered a simple question. What was happening in the streets outside while Godfrey knelt in prayer? Those were the cries of people being killed. That was the fire consuming the Jewish synagogue. Those were the bodies piled in the streets. Godfrey de Bouillon's personal piety was real, and the massacre he did not stop was equally real. Both things existed within the same man, at the same moment, in the same city. That is the kind of thing history often has no simple answer for. In the centuries following Godfrey's death, Christian poets and theologians constructed around him a legend increasingly detached from reality. He was placed among the 9 worthies, the 9 greatest figures in human history according to medieval reckoning. Compared to the heroes of antiquity, his statue still stands in the Grand Place in Brussels to this day. In recent years, a growing number of scholars have called for a more honest reassessment of the Godfrey legend. Not to erase him from history, but to look squarely at what actually took place. The story of Godfrey de Bouillon is not the story of an obvious villain. If he were a straightforward evildoer, the story would be simpler and far less dangerous. What is more unsettling is that in the eyes of many of his contemporaries, Godfrey de Bouillon was a good man. He was courageous. He was devout. He was more humble than most lords of his time. And it was the very Christian priests who marched with that army who recorded the massacre in prose that rang with pride and gratitude to God. This means that the entire system of values in which Godfrey de Bouillon was born and raised did not regard what happened in Jerusalem as a crime. It was regarded as a victory, as God's grace. And that is the most unsettling lesson history can teach. Not that wicked people sometimes do wicked things, but that false belief systems can transform ordinary people into instruments of catastrophe, while they remain utterly convinced they are doing what is right. Godfrey de Bouillon believed he was serving God, and 30,000 people in Jerusalem believed that no one could possibly be cruel enough to kill them all. Both were wrong. Chapter 4. Richard I. If you asked any European to name a perfect knight of the crusading era, the name Richard I would surface almost immediately. Lionheart, the hero of the Third Crusade, the emblem of European chivalric spirit. His statue still stands imposingly before the British Parliament building to this day. But on an afternoon in August 1191, on a field outside the city of Acre, that hero issued an order that even those within his own ranks could not fully justify. Richard was born in 1157, son of King Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. He grew up in the south of France, steeped in the culture of the troubadours with their romantic ideals of love and honor. From a very young age, he displayed exceptional military talent, tall, brave to the point of recklessness, and possessed of a natural command authority that even his enemies acknowledged. Saladin, Richard's greatest adversary, expressed admiration for that talent on multiple occasions in diplomatic correspondence. But there is one detail that mythmakers tend to overlook. Before ascending to the throne, Richard had no hesitation in rebelling against his own father when his interests demanded it. He was as much a pragmatic politician as he was an idealistic warrior. On his way to the Holy Land, Richard stopped at Cyprus and conquered it within a matter of weeks. The official version holds that he attacked because the island's ruler had mistreated survivors from shipwrecked English vessels, including his own betrothed. This is true, but not the whole picture. Richard also recognized in Cyprus a perfect logistical base for the entire campaign. He took its ruler prisoner with a promise of no iron chains, a promise kept by substituting silver chains instead. He subsequently sold the island, bought it back, then sold it again. This was not the conduct of an idealistic knight, but of a man who understood the strategic and economic value of everything around him. Acre was the most important port city on the Mediterranean coast of the Holy Land. Since 1189, Crusader forces had been besieging the city in a peculiar situation. They surrounded Acre from outside, while Saladin's army surrounded them from yet further outside. This double siege dragged on for nearly 2 years, killing an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 Crusaders in that phase alone. When Richard arrived in June 1191 with a large fleet and well-rested troops, Acre surrendered in fewer than 6 weeks. The standard terms of surrender: the Muslim garrison and their families to be released safely. In exchange, the Muslim side would pay 200,000 gold dinars in ransom, release 1,500 Christian prisoners, and return the true cross. During the period of fulfillment, approximately 2,700 Muslims remained in Acre as hostages to guarantee compliance. This was an arrangement with clear precedent in both Christian and Muslim laws of war in the medieval period. Hostages were held to ensure enforcement, not to serve as sacrificial victims. Saladin began carrying out the terms, but encountered practical difficulties. Assembling the required number of Christian prisoners and collecting the enormous ransom sum took longer than anticipated. He requested an extension and offered to pay a portion in advance as a show of good faith. The two sides read the situation in entirely different ways. From Saladin's perspective, he was acting in good faith but was impeded by practical obstacles. From Richard's perspective, Saladin was deliberately stalling and violating the agreement. The truth likely lies somewhere between the two. Saladin may have been simultaneously sincere and opportunistic, while Richard was simultaneously genuinely concerned and looking for a reason to march south without further delay. After the final deadline passed, Richard ordered all 2,700 hostages brought out to the field of Tel al-Ayadiyah outside Acre. Saladin's army was encamped on the hills overlooking the scene. They could see what was unfolding, but were too far away and too few in position to intervene. Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad, Saladin's personal secretary and historian, who witnessed events directly from the hillside, recorded that Richard's men bound the hostages' hands and began killing. Not in the course of battle, not amid chaos, but in an organized, deliberate execution. Ambroise, a French troubadour who accompanied the crusading army and wrote a chronicle from a perspective sympathetic to Richard, also confirmed the event, describing it simply in more apologetic language. All 2,700 people died that afternoon. The wives and children of many of them were close enough to watch. This detail is not merely an emotional one. It proves this was a public, calculated act, not chaos beyond anyone's control. A decision made by Richard I of England. Richard's defenders offer a familiar argument. He could not continue his march south while guarding nearly 3,000 hostages. The troops required for that task would have significantly weakened his fighting force. This argument has practical merit, and that is precisely what makes it troubling. Because if we accept it, we are saying that the lives of 2,700 bound prisoners had utilitarian value equivalent to the logistical cost of guarding them. And when the balance tipped toward inconvenience, the solution was to eliminate them. Even in the 12th century, not everyone accepted this argument. Richard continued his march south with iron discipline. On September 7, 1191, at Arsuf, he achieved the greatest military victory of the Third Crusade, converting an unauthorized cavalry charge into a full-force counterattack in an instant. Richard's military genius is beyond dispute. But after Arsuf, the campaign grew complicated. Richard twice advanced to within reach of Jerusalem and twice ordered a withdrawal, on pragmatic grounds. Even if the city could be taken, there were insufficient forces to hold it long-term, once most of the Crusaders returned to Europe after fulfilling their vow. That strategic assessment was probably correct. But it also meant that the entire Third Crusade, for all its enormous sacrifice, ended without recapturing Jerusalem. On September 2, 1192, Richard and Saladin signed the Treaty of Jaffa. Christians kept the coastal strip. Christian pilgrims were granted free access to Jerusalem. Jerusalem remained under Saladin's rule. 3 years of fighting, tens of thousands dead, 2,700 hostages executed. In return, the right to visit a city that Christians did not control. Richard left the Holy Land immediately after signing the treaty and never returned. He died in 1199 from an infected wound caused by a crossbow bolt during a minor and unremarkable siege in France. The question history poses about Richard I is not whether he possessed talent or courage. He clearly had both. The question is, can those qualities justify what happened on the field of Tel al-Ayadiyah? Saladin, when he retook Jerusalem in 1187, ordered that no civilians be killed and ransomed thousands of the poor who could not afford their own freedom from his personal treasury, a fact recorded by both Christian and Muslim historians of the time and disputed by no one. That contrast is not evidence that Muslims were better than Christians or vice versa. It is simpler than that. Even in the 12th century, amid savage religious warfare, choices existed. Saladin made one choice. Richard made another. And 2,700 bound men on the field at Acre had no choice at all. The statue of Richard I still stands before the British Parliament. The legend of Lionheart lives on robustly in books, films, and stories. But history, when read fully and with honesty, does not permit us to keep only the beautiful parts of a person and discard the rest. Richard I was great, and Richard I ordered the execution of 2,700 bound prisoners. Both of these things are true, and we must hold both in mind simultaneously if we genuinely wish to understand who he was. Chapter 5. Tancred of Hauteville. Among the roster of brutal knights of the Crusades, Tancred of Hauteville is the least known name. No monument, no heroic epithet, no place in textbooks. But the people who took shelter in the Temple of Solomon on July 15, 1099, those who put their faith in his banner, knew his name very well. They simply did not survive to tell of it. Tancred was born around 1075 of the Hauteville line, the Norman dynasty that had conquered southern Italy and Sicily, making both the Byzantine Empire and the papacy tremble. His grandfather was an impoverished knight with 12 sons and almost nothing to his name. Those sons went out into the world and conquered it. Growing up in such an environment, Tancred absorbed the defining culture of the Hautevilles. The ambition to conquer was normal. Violence was a legitimate political tool, and a promise held value only as long as it remained useful. In 1095, when Pope Urban II called for the crusade, Tancred was 20 years old and had nothing yet to lose. He set out alongside his uncle Bohemond, not out of faith, but because this was an opportunity to do what the Hautevilles had always done: conquer and seize land. At Tarsus, Tancred clashed with Baldwin of Bouillon as both men competed for the city. Baldwin subsequently allowed 300 of Tancred's Norman soldiers to be attacked and killed in the night without intervening, though he could have done so. This grudge smoldered for years and would shape Tancred's actions at Jerusalem. At Bethlehem, Tancred separated from the main army, arrived ahead of the others, and planted his banner on the Church of the Nativity. Chroniclers describe this as a gesture of piety. But the nature of the act was identical to what the Hauteville line had done across generations. Arrive first, plant the flag, establish a claim of ownership. That it occurred at a sacred site did not alter the logic behind it. When the assault on Jerusalem began on July 14, 1099, Tancred commanded the southern flank, near the temple precinct, which housed the Dome of the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and nearly 4 centuries of accumulated wealth under Muslim stewardship. When the walls were breached, Tancred moved toward the temple faster than almost anyone else. Thousands of Muslim civilians and soldiers poured into the area seeking refuge. Tancred arrived before they could escape. Those inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque sought to surrender. Tancred accepted and gave them his banner. In the medieval code of honor, the most solemn personal pledge a knight could extend. Those inside the temple trusted that banner. They had no other choice. That night, Tancred left the temple precinct. The precise reason was not recorded. On the morning of July 16th, other Crusader soldiers poured in and killed everyone sheltering within. Raymond of Aguilers recorded that blood reached ankle height and regarded this as evidence of God's judgment. Fulcher of Chartres confirmed that no one was spared. Upon learning the news, Tancred returned and protested. He was angry that his honor had been violated, but he did not stop the massacre, or did not wish to stop it with enough force to actually do so. Under the medieval framework of responsibility, a knight who had extended his protection was obligated to enforce it by arms if necessary, even against fellow soldiers. Tancred did not do this. There is a detail that chroniclers recorded but seldom analyzed. Immediately after securing the temple precinct, Tancred took all the treasure within: gold, silver, precious metal lamps, Persian carpets, religious artifacts accumulated across nearly 4 centuries. Raymond of Aguilers, not a writer especially critical of Tancred, still noted that he carried away many riches from the temple. This was not random looting in the chaos. This was the systematic appropriation by a commander who had arrived first and controlled the area before anyone else could reach it. A natural question follows. Was this the real reason Tancred moved so swiftly toward the temple? And if so, was the protective banner genuinely protection, or merely a means of keeping those inside from fleeing or resisting while he conducted the plunder? No document confirms or refutes this, but the combination of his speed of movement and what occurred immediately afterward produces a picture that is difficult to explain otherwise. Modern historians are divided into 3 schools when assessing Tancred. Fully innocent. He extended his protection, gave no order to kill, and objected when he learned what had happened. The killers were soldiers from other commands, not under his authority. Indirect responsibility. He extended protection and then departed without leaving a force strong enough to enforce it. Under the medieval framework of accountability, this constitutes an indefensible failure of duty. Questions of motive. If the protective banner was merely a crowd control instrument while he seized the valuables, then it was never genuine protection to begin with, but an act of deception. Once he had taken what he wanted and left, the fate of those who remained was no longer his concern. Godfrey de Bouillon was elected ruler of Jerusalem, something Tancred did not accept without difficulty, given that the grievance from Tarsus still lingered. When Godfrey died in 1100 and Baldwin I, that same brother from Tarsus, assumed the throne, Tancred resolved the conflict in characteristically Hauteville fashion. He moved to Antioch, where his uncle Bohemond was ruling, and operated from there. In the years that followed, in Antioch and Galilee, certain patterns in Tancred's behavior recurred with enough consistency to become personal hallmarks. He flatly refused to return territories that under the original agreement were to be handed over to the Byzantine Empire. He did not hesitate to use force against Christian allies when his interests required it. Galilee under his rule is described in multiple sources as a land that was exploited rather than governed for the benefit of its people. Tancred died in December 1112 in Antioch from illness, at around 37 years of age, leaving no direct heir. There is an irony worth noting. Tancred of Hauteville later became the central figure of Torquato Tasso's epic poem, Jerusalem Delivered, 1581, nearly 500 years after his death. In that work, Tancred is the most idealistic knight of the entire crusading army, a tragic lover, the embodiment of honor and magnanimity. Tasso exerted an enormous influence on European culture, and generations of Europeans came to picture Tancred through his lens. The distance between legend and reality in this case has few rivals. .com. Tancred of Hauteville is a defining example of the kind of man the Crusades both produced and required. Brave enough and ruthless enough to do what was necessary, clever enough to use religious idealism as a cover for worldly ambition. The people standing inside the Temple of Solomon on the night of July 15th, clutching the cloth bearing Tancred's insignia, they did not know that banner had been given by a man who had already taken everything worth taking, then walked out and did not look back. That is the real history, not Tasso's poem. Chapter 6. Bohemond I of Antioch. Some people are brutal because they cannot control themselves. Some are brutal because they are afraid. And some are brutal because they have calculated carefully that brutality will deliver what they want. Bohemond I of Antioch belonged to the third kind. He was the most intelligent, most cunning, and perhaps most dangerous figure in the entire First Crusade. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I, who had dealt with and assessed dozens of crusader lords through the eyes of a seasoned politician, told his daughter that Bohemond was the only one among all the leaders he genuinely feared. Anna Komnene, who later wrote the Alexiad, described Bohemond in language that mixed admiration with dread. Exceptionally tall, with short blonde hair, and something in his gaze that made one feel they were standing before a predator dressed in fine clothes. Bohemond was born around 1058, the eldest son of Robert Guiscard, the greatest Norman of the 11th century, the man who built an empire from southern Italy to Sicily, defeated both the Byzantines and Muslim forces, and very nearly conquered Constantinople before dying of plague in 1085. Bohemond was a nickname given by tradition after a legendary giant in folktales, because the child was unusually large from birth. The name stayed with him for life. Growing up alongside Robert Guiscard, Bohemond learned not only military skills, but the arts of politics and negotiation, and more importantly, how to see the world as a power game in which moral ideals were tools to be used when useful and discarded when they became a burden. When Robert Guiscard died, he left the bulk of his inheritance to the son from his second wife. Bohemond received only a small portion of territory in southern Italy, not nearly enough to satisfy the ambitions of a man trained by an emperor. This is the crucial psychological foundation for understanding why he joined the crusade and why he did what he did. In 1096, when the crusading army passed through his territory on the way to Constantinople, Bohemond was commanding a campaign against the Byzantines that was not going well. He saw in the crusade an opportunity too good to pass up. There is a famous anecdote about the moment of decision. Bohemond was watching the army march past, when he suddenly ordered his most expensive cloak brought out, tore it into strips, and distributed the pieces to his soldiers as a symbol of renouncing worldly wealth. The men cheered with enthusiasm. That dramatically perfect gesture was Bohemond in a single distilled moment, reading the crowd correctly, acting at exactly the right time, making a powerful impression, with a cold calculation of personal interest behind the performance. There is no evidence he joined for religious reasons. Everything that followed indicates his true objective was to find a kingdom in the east to compensate for what he had lost in the west. When the army reached Constantinople, Alexios I required all the lords to swear loyalty and commit to returning to Byzantium any lands taken from Muslims that had previously belonged to the empire. Most lords reluctantly agreed because they needed logistical support. Bohemond not only agreed, but did so with unusual enthusiasm, even offering to serve Alexios as a general under his command if granted authority over Byzantine forces in the Holy Land. Alexios declined. According to Anna Komnene, her father said privately that he declined not because he doubted Bohemond's abilities, but precisely because he trusted those abilities too well. To hand command of the Byzantine army to Bohemond was to hand the fox the keys to the henhouse. Bohemond swore his oath of loyalty to Alexios. Both men knew the oath was worth exactly as long as it remained useful to Bohemond. The crusading army reached Antioch in October 1097. This was one of the most strongly fortified cities in the Middle East, with walls stretching more than 40 kilometers and encircling an entire mountain. The siege lasted 8 months and became a grinding war of attrition that devastated both sides. Hunger, disease, and despair were the three dominant forces of the winter of 1097 to 1098. Thousands died, not by sword, but from dysentery, typhoid, and starvation. War horses were slaughtered and eaten. Many soldiers deserted or took their own lives. This was the setting for the most horrifying event that Bohemond's name is associated with. On one night during the siege, according to the account of Radolf of Caen in his Gesta Tancredi, a Norman cleric who supported the Normans and was no enemy of Bohemond, Bohemond ordered a number of Muslim prisoners killed and their bodies roasted. Radolf argues that Bohemond did this to create the impression among the other leaders that Norman soldiers were eating human flesh, thereby discouraging those who were plotting against him within the army. This defense does nothing to help Bohemond's reputation. It merely replaces spontaneous brutality with brutality that was calculated and politically purposeful. Some modern historians further argue this was also the pragmatic response of a commander facing soldiers on the verge of starvation. Albert of Aachen, a German historian who gathered accounts from returning survivors, recorded the event in language of evident horror with no attempt at justification. News of this event spread beyond the camp and reached the Muslim world. The story of the Franks eating prisoners persisted for centuries in Islamic historical and religious texts as evidence of European barbarity. Within the army itself, the event was noted but almost entirely unchallenged in public, something that speaks for itself about the moral condition of that army after 8 months of siege in hellish circumstances. If the burning episode revealed Bohemond's brutal side, then the manner in which he took Antioch revealed his cunning side, and the two complemented each other to produce a uniquely dangerous man. Around the beginning of 1098, Bohemond made secret contact with Firuz, an Armenian or Syrian officer who had converted to Islam and commanded a section of Antioch's walls. The arrangement: Firuz would open the gate at night in exchange for his personal safety and possibly a financial reward. But before carrying it out, Bohemond did something characteristic of his political thinking. He convened a meeting of the lords and proposed that whoever found a way to open Antioch's gates would have the right to control the city once taken. If they agreed, he would have legal grounds for claiming Antioch. If they refused, he would proceed with the plan anyway and claim it by the fact of possession. In the early hours of June 3, 1098, Firuz opened the gate. Bohemond's men poured in first. Antioch fell after 8 months. What happened inside Antioch followed a familiar pattern: indiscriminate massacre, including native Christians within the city, because in the chaos, soldiers could not or did not distinguish who was who. Yagi Sian, the garrison commander, attempted to escape but was caught and killed by local villagers. His head was brought to Bohemond as a trophy. Immediately afterward, Bohemond planted his banner on the tallest buildings and declared control. Raymond of Toulouse objected forcefully, arguing that the commitment to return land to Byzantium had to be honored. Bohemond dismissed this with simple logic. He had found the way to open the gate. His soldiers had entered first, and he was in actual control of most of the city at that very moment. No one had sufficient force or will to compel him to give it up. Scarcely had the city fallen when the army discovered they were in a worse position than before. Kerboga's enormous army now besieged the city from outside. the roles had entirely reversed. Just as morale sank to the point where many advocated surrender, a humble priest announced he had found the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced Christ's side beneath the floor of a church within the city. Bohemond was skeptical about the relic's authenticity, but intelligent enough to recognize its psychological value. On June 28, 1098, with the Holy Lance carried at the head of the formation, the Crusaders opened the gates and attacked. Kerboga's army collapsed, by Christian accounts through divine intervention, by Muslim accounts through internal divisions within the coalition, and Antioch was no longer in dispute. Bohemond refused all demands to hand the city over to Byzantium, citing the fact that Alexios had failed to come to the army's relief at its most desperate hour. Many later historians argue that Bohemond or his agents had manipulated information to lead Alexios to believe the situation was hopeless, thereby preventing him from arriving in time, and thus eliminating the Byzantine claim. Whatever the truth, the result was that Bohemond had obtained what he had wanted before ever leaving Italy, a kingdom of his own in the east. In 1100, during a campaign in Anatolia, Bohemond was ambushed and taken prisoner by the Danishmend Turks. 3 years in captivity did not break him. He used the time to learn the language and study the culture of those who held him. After being ransomed in 1103, Bohemond made a surprising decision. He went to Europe. He traveled through southern Italy and France to a hero's reception, married Constance, daughter of King Philip I of France, to secure a political foundation, then recruited a new army under the stated aim of continuing the fight for the Holy Land. His real objective was to attack Byzantium. In 1107, he crossed the Adriatic and attacked Byzantine territory in the Balkans, declaring the campaign part of the war against Islam, an argument that even many of his own allies struggled to receive with a straight face, given that the Byzantines were Christians. The campaign was a catastrophic failure. Alexios had prepared thoroughly and was far stronger, surrounding and isolating Bohemond's army until it could neither advance nor withdraw. In 1108, Bohemond signed the Treaty of Duval, recognizing Antioch as Byzantine territory and becoming a vassal of the emperor. This was the heaviest defeat of his life, delivered by the very man he had miscalculated for so many years. Bohemond never returned to Antioch. He died in 1111 in Apulia, southern Italy, at around 53 years of age. His tomb at Canossa di Puglia survives to this day, a beautiful structure with a dome bearing the unmistakable influence of Islamic architecture. A final irony for a man who spent his life fighting against and plundering the Islamic world. Anna Komnene concludes her account of Bohemond with a line that many later scholars have regarded as the most accurate assessment ever rendered. Bohemond was a man talented enough to have been great, but lacking enough in virtue to never have been good. Across the entirety of the First Crusade, Bohemond was the most gifted military commander, the most pragmatic politician, and the most far-sighted strategist. But he was also the man who ordered prisoners burned, broke his oaths when they no longer served him, and built his kingdom on a foundation of deliberate betrayal and violence. The most telling thing about Bohemond is not any specific act he committed. The most telling thing is that he was the perfect product of a system in which brutality was wrapped in religious idealism. And within that system, the man intelligent enough to see through the wrapping and act from pure self-interest became the most effective and the most dangerous of all. Bohemond did not believe in the crusade as a holy pilgrimage. He believed in the crusade as an opportunity, and in that belief, he was completely honest with himself in a way that many of his more devout companions never dared to be about themselves. Chapter 7. Arnaud Amaury. Among the roster of crusading brutalists, everyone who came before at least carried a sword. They fought, they commanded, they were present on the battlefield and bore personal risk. Arnaud Amaury carried no sword. He carried a crucifix. He wore a monk's habit. He recited prayers every morning and every evening. and he killed more people than almost anyone who carried a sword in the entire history of the Crusades, by the simple act of opening his mouth and speaking a single sentence. Arnaud Amaury belonged to the Cistercian order, one of the most rigorous monastic orders of the medieval period, renowned for iron discipline and absolute loyalty to the Pope. He rose rapidly through the hierarchy, and by around 1198 to 1199 became Abbot General of the Cistercians, the head of the entire order, with hundreds of monasteries spread across Europe, one of the most influential positions in the Catholic Church, second only to the Pope, and a handful of the most senior cardinals. He was described as sharply intelligent, deeply versed in theology, possessed of outstanding oratory, and utterly without compromise on what he regarded as matters of faith. This was no blind fanatic. This was a highly educated, rigorously trained man who believed deeply in what he was doing. And that is precisely why he was more dangerous than any stupid fanatic could ever be. In 1198, Pope Innocent III ascended with a vision of a Europe unified under absolute papal authority. The Cathar movement in southern France was one of the greatest threats to that vision. The Cathars rejected papal authority and the entire system of Catholic sacraments. By the early 13th century, a vast region of southern France had effectively passed beyond Rome's religious control. In 1203, after peaceful missionary missions had failed entirely, Innocent III assigned Arnaud Amaury a special task: to lead a delegation with the authority of a papal legate to salvage the situation. 5 years in southern France revealed that the problem was not simply the Cathars. The problem was an entire social system that had integrated Cathar existence into its own fabric. Local lords protected them because the Cathars were craftsmen, merchants, neighbors, and family. Local Catholic bishops had accommodated this reality. Arnaud Amaury grew progressively more frustrated and more rigid. He wrote of southern France as a land that could not be healed by medicine, but only by the knife. In 1208, Pierre de Castelnau, another Cistercian monk serving as a papal legate, was assassinated. Innocent III declared a crusade and appointed Arnaud Amaury as legatus, papal legate and spiritual leader of the entire campaign. Understanding the office of legatus is essential to understanding how dangerous Arnaud Amaury was. A legatus was the Pope's fully empowered representative. He could command any bishop, cardinal, or Christian lord to comply. He could impose excommunication, cutting a person off from the Christian community, which meant no one was permitted to trade with or speak to that person. He could declare someone a heretic and strip them of all legal rights. More significantly, in the context of the Crusade, Arnaud Amaury was the one who determined who received the complete indulgence the Pope had promised to those joining the campaign. He could decide whether a specific action was pleasing to God or not. No lord in the army, including Simon de Montfort after he was elected military commander, could disregard his ruling without facing grave religious consequences. In the summer of 1209, the crusading army assembled at Lyon, estimated at between 15,000 and 25,000 men, including knights, infantry, and a large contingent of mercenary ribots, men who fought for the right to plunder rather than out of religious conviction. Before the army reached Béziers, Arnaud Amaury compiled a list of 222 prominent Cathars within the city and delivered an ultimatum to the city's leaders. Hand over those on the list and the city would not be attacked. This detail matters. 222 people represented a very small fraction of Béziers' population of roughly 10 to 15,000. The majority of residents were Orthodox Catholics. In theory, only 222 people faced consequences. The people of Béziers refused. They were not willing to hand their neighbors and relatives over to strangers arriving from the north. Arnaud Amaury received the refusal. He was now faced with a decision. On July 22, 1209, Béziers fell when a group of ribots launched a spontaneous attack. The city gates were forced open, and the entire army poured in. The famous sentence attached to this event, Cadete eos, novit enim dominus, qui sunt eius. Kill them all. God will know his own. This quote first appears in the work of Cæsarius of Heisterbach, a German Cistercian monk writing some 10 to 25 years after the event, who was not present at Béziers and recorded it as an anecdote he had heard. Modern historians debate its authenticity. But there is one piece of evidence that requires no debate: the letter that Arnaud Amaury himself sent to Pope Innocent III reporting the victory. In that letter, written in Latin, he stated that soldiers had killed the enemy without distinction of age, sex, or rank, and offered the figure of nearly 20,000 killed. 3 points deserve emphasis. The figure of 20,000 came from Arnaud Amaury himself, not from an enemy fabricating atrocities. He described the absence of any distinction among victims as something positive, not as a regrettable error. And the tone of the entire letter is the tone of a man reporting a success. Modern historians estimate Béziers' population at fewer than 15,000 at the time, so the figure of 20,000 may include people who had fled from the surrounding countryside or may simply be an exaggeration. But no one disputes that thousands died, that no distinction was made between Cathars and Catholics, and that Arnaud Amaury knew this and regarded it as an acceptable outcome. There is a detail that both defenders and critics of Arnaud Amaury tend to handle inadequately. The majority of Béziers' population were Orthodox Catholics. When the Crusaders poured in, those Catholics fled into the Church of La Madeleine, trusting that their Catholic identity and their presence in a church would protect them. The Crusaders broke down the doors and killed everyone inside, including those kneeling in prayer before the altar. Arnaud Amaury knew that the majority of Béziers' residents were Catholics. He had himself compiled the list of 222 Cathars, which meant he knew perfectly well that the remainder were not on it. When he chose not to stop the massacre and then reported it as a success, he had rendered a clear verdict. The deaths of Béziers' Catholics were an acceptable price to ensure that no Cathars escaped. The phrase, "God will know his own," if it was spoken, reflects this logic precisely. Catholics who died unjustly would be taken to heaven by God. Cathars who died were receiving deserved punishment. In both cases, those carrying out the killing bore no guilt because they could not distinguish between them. This is a carefully constructed theological logic system designed to eliminate completely the moral responsibility of the decision-maker. Arnaud Amaury continued directing the Albigensian campaign for many years. In 1212, he was appointed Archbishop of Narbonne, a reward for services rendered. But the most revealing episode of his character came afterward. He began disputing authority with Simon de Montfort himself over the question of who truly controlled the conquered lands, the church or the military lords. The conflict escalated to the point where, in 1215, Arnaud Amaury declared Simon de Montfort excommunicated, cutting off the very man he had campaigned alongside throughout the war from the Christian community. This detail receives little attention but is enormously revealing. Even towards someone who shared his convictions and had fought beside him, Arnaud Amaury was willing to deploy the most powerful theological weapon available when the interests of power demanded it. For him, faith was not an obstacle to power, but an instrument of it. When Innocent III received the victory letter from Arnaud Amaury, he did not condemn the massacre, but neither did he formally praise it. He remained silent on the specific details and continued to support the campaign. That silence carried clear meaning. What had happened at Béziers exceeded what Innocent III wished to attach his name to publicly, while the strategic outcome was one he could not but welcome. This is how systems of power permit brutality to persist without anyone needing to issue an explicit order. The one who truly gave the order never has to state it plainly, and the one who carried it out can always claim to have acted according to their best understanding of their superior's will. Arnaud Amaury died in 1225 in Narbonne, with no discernible sign of remorse over Béziers or any part of the Albigensian campaign. His legacy raises questions not only of individual responsibility, but of institutional and systemic responsibility. Arnaud Amaury was not a renegade or someone acting outside any framework. He was a senior official appointed by the supreme leader of his organization, implementing policy sanctioned by that organization, and rewarded with promotion upon completing his mission. When an individual acts with brutality in the name of an organization, and with that organization's authorization, who bears responsibility? The individual? The organization? Its leadership? The theological system that provided the intellectual foundation for those actions? The answer is perhaps all of them simultaneously. And the phrase, "Kill them all, God will know his own," whether spoken or not, has lived 800 years as the most concise and chilling symbol of a question humanity has yet to answer satisfactorily. When does belief in an absolute truth become a license to kill? That is not a historical question. It is a question of the present. The psychological structure and the logic behind that phrase, the idea that a sufficiently important end can justify any means, and that those who die unjustly will be compensated elsewhere by a higher power, is not something that vanished with the 13th century. Arnaud Amaury is dead. His words live on. Chapter 8. Emicho of Leiningen. Everyone on this list before him made it to the Holy Land. They fought at Antioch, at Jerusalem, at Acre. However brutal they were, they at least did what they claimed was the reason they took up arms. Emicho of Leiningen never reached the Holy Land. He stopped along the way to kill people, not Muslims, not enemies of Christianity by any defensible definition. He killed Jews, people living peacefully in the cities along the Rhine in Germany, people who had no connection to Jerusalem, no connection to the crusade. And he did it with complete certainty that God was on his side. Pope Urban II's call for a crusade spread with a speed and intensity that even he had not anticipated. Rather than an organized campaign under the command of experienced lords, the first wave was tens of thousands of peasants, clergy, craftsmen, and the urban poor who began moving eastward many months before the original plan. This was not an army. This was a religious mass movement driven by piety, economic desperation, a hunger for adventure, and the kind of collective frenzy for which history offers few comparable examples. Within that context, a dangerous idea began to spread. If the purpose of the crusade was to avenge those who had wronged Christianity, why march all the way to Jerusalem when Jews were living right there in the cities of Europe? This logic was entirely wrong, but it was simple enough to propagate through a fervent crowd and dangerous enough to translate into action. Emicho was a German lord of the middling nobility in the Rhine region. Albert of Aachen, the Christian historian who wrote the Chronicle of the First Crusade and who generally showed sympathy for the crusading perspective, described Emicho as someone who had lived a fierce and unbridled life before his religious vision. The polite medieval formulation for describing a man with a history of violence and plunder. Emicho claimed that Christ had appeared to him, placed a cross upon his body, and declared him chosen to lead an army fighting for the faith. He was promised a crown from the emperor at Constantinople and the conquest of the entire Muslim world before the Day of Judgment. No one confirmed or refuted this vision, but it is clear that Emicho believed it genuinely and deeply. That belief, combined with a pre-existing violent temperament and the religious frenzy of 1096, produced a lethal combination. In the spring of 1096, Emicho recruited an army estimated at anywhere from a few thousand to more than 10,000 men. One crucial point to understand: this army was not composed solely of thugs and plunderers. It also included genuinely devout poor peasants, local priests who had preached the crusade and now joined to practice what they taught, and women who brought their small children because they believed this was God's will. That is why what Emicho led was more dangerous than an organized criminal band. It was a popular movement directed by a fanatical leader. The first city attacked was Speyer. Its bishop, John, acted swiftly and decisively. He sheltered the Jewish community in the episcopal buildings, posted guards to protect the Jewish quarter, and then punished those who had participated in the attacks by having their hands cut off. A severe punishment that showed he regarded the assault on Jews as a violation of law, not a legitimate religious act. About 11 Jews died before Bishop John's forces intervened. Speyer was the exception. What happened in the cities that followed shows what occurs when there is no Bishop John present. At Worms, the Jewish community split into two groups when word of the approaching army arrived. One group stayed in their homes, another fled to the palace of Bishop Adalbert seeking protection. On May 18, 1096, Emicho's army arrived. Those who had remained home were attacked first. The chronicles describe entire families killed in their own houses. The mob then turned toward the bishop's palace. Adalbert, unlike Bishop John in Speyer, either lacked or was unwilling to deploy sufficient force to stop them. Some Jews in Worms, facing certain death, killed themselves and their children rather than be killed by the mob. This detail recurs throughout the Jewish chronicles of 1096. These were not acts of parents who did not love their children, but acts of people who believed that a clean death, according to religious rite, was preferable to being killed by those forcing them to abandon their faith. The total death toll at Worms is estimated at several hundred to over 1,000 people. Mainz was the largest city and home to the most substantial Jewish community in the Rhine region, and the site of the greatest massacre. The Jewish community there pooled a large sum of money and turned to Archbishop Ruthard, one of the most powerful officials in the region. Ruthard accepted the money and agreed to provide protection, moving them into his palaces and buildings. When Emicho's army arrived at the end of May, what happened next remains disputed. Some sources say Ruthard lacked sufficient force to confront the large army and simply withdrew. Contemporary Jewish chronicles describe him as having betrayed those who paid for his protection. Whatever the truth, the outcome is clear. Emicho's army gained access to the buildings where the Jews were sheltering. Three contemporary Jewish chronicles, written in Hebrew by members of the Ashkenazi community, some of them direct witnesses, describe scenes that no words in any modern language can fully convey. Whole families dying by their own hands together, parents cutting the throats of their children and then their own, rabbis clutching Torah scrolls as the mob broke in, the elderly and children killed in the streets. The death toll at Mainz is estimated at several hundred to over 1,000 people. After Mainz, Emicho's army and similar groups went on to attack Jewish communities in Cologne, Trier, Metz, Regensburg, and numerous smaller towns. Each place had its own details but followed the same pattern. The army arrives, demands that Jews convert. Those who refuse are killed. Some accept conversion under threat of death in order to survive. The situation of those who converted under coercion became a subject of complex and painful debate within the Jewish community for years afterward. Jewish law essentially requires a Jew to accept death rather than convert under compulsion. But the reality of 1096 raised questions of guilt and forgiveness that rabbis struggled to answer for decades. At Cologne, Archbishop Hermann III saved many lives by dispersing the Jewish community to villages and castles throughout the region. At Trier, the effort at protection was less successful, and the archbishop subsequently permitted those who had converted under coercion to return to Judaism, an act whose validity the Pope himself had to adjudicate. After leaving the Rhineland, Emicho's army confronted harsh reality when attempting to cross through Hungary. King Koloman of Hungary refused to allow the undisciplined army to pass through his territory. Peter the Hermit's army had caused looting and violence on its way through, and Koloman had no reason to believe Emicho would be different. When Emicho's army attempted to force the crossing, the Hungarian army counterattacked. At the Battle of Nitra, Emicho's force was routed. Survivors fled in panic. Emicho escaped with his life and retreated westward. The man to whom Christ had granted a vision, who had been promised a crown in Constantinople and the conquest of the Muslim world, never came any closer to Constantinople than the Hungarian border. He returned to Germany and vanished almost entirely from history, except for the enormous wound he left in the history of European Jewish communities. The total number of victims in the Rhineland massacres of 1096 is a question historians disagree on and will likely never resolve with certainty. Most current academic research places the figure at approximately 4,000 to 8,000 people. Whatever the precise number, this was the largest organized act of religious violence targeting Jews ever to have occurred in Europe up to that point, completely destroying or severely devastating some of the largest and most learned Jewish communities on the continent, cultural and religious centers that had existed for centuries. For European Jewish communities, 1096 was never forgotten. Elegies in Hebrew were composed to memorialize those who died in the Rhineland and recited in religious services, some of them still part of Jewish liturgy today. The concept of Kiddush Hashem, the sanctification of God's name through acceptance of martyrdom, was examined and discussed with new depth in Jewish theology after 1096. And more significantly, 1096 marked a turning point in the consciousness of European Jews regarding their relationship with the surrounding Christian society. Before that, Jewish communities along the Rhine had lived in conditions of relative stability, with commercial and sometimes friendly relations with their Christian neighbors across many generations. After 1096, an awareness of the fragility of that position never fully disappeared. There is an important and painful historical question. What responsibility does Urban II's call for the Crusade bear for what happened in the Rhineland? No one argues that Urban II intended these attacks, but the language of the crusading call had created a psychological framework in which violence in the name of faith was sanctified, in which the enemies of Christianity were presented as deserving of destruction. Emicho and his followers simply applied that logic to the Jews living all around them rather than to the Muslims far away. This is not an exoneration of Emicho, but it shows that violence consecrated by religious language tends to spill beyond its originally intended targets, and those who unleash such violence cannot be entirely without responsibility for the consequences they did not foresee. The Rhineland massacres of 1096 established a dangerous precedent, that in times of instability and religious frenzy, European Jewish communities could be attacked by inflamed mobs with no serious consequences for those who carried out the violence. That precedent was repeated in the decades and centuries that followed, from the Second and Third Crusades to the Black Death of 1348, from the waves of expulsion of Jews from England, France, and Spain, to the massacres in Eastern Europe in the 17th century, and ultimately to the Holocaust of the 20th. None of those who enacted those events were direct students of Emicho, but all drew from the same reservoir of hatred that Emicho helped normalize in 1096. The idea that Jews were the natural enemies of Christianity and that their presence in society was a problem requiring a solution. The story of Emicho is not the story of a madman or an aberration. It is the story of what happens when hatred is given a religious language to justify itself, when a leader combines personal charisma with fanaticism, and when the institutions created to protect the vulnerable choose instead to look away. That is not a lesson of the 11th century. It is a lesson of every century. Chapter 9. Guy of Lusignan. In this roster, most of those who came before were active perpetrators of brutality. They gave orders to kill, they attacked, they destroyed. Their danger lay in what they did. Guy of Lusignan was dangerous in a different way. His danger lay in what he failed to do, in decisions made by someone without the capacity to make them, and in how he clung to power at any cost, while having no idea what to do with that power. He did not kill tens of thousands with his own hands. He killed them through incompetence, stubbornness, and the fear of losing what he had never truly deserved to have. Sometimes that is worse than deliberate cruelty. Guy of Lusignan was born around 1150 in Poitou, western France, the third son of a family of middling nobility. As the third son, he inherited nothing of consequence. By medieval custom, younger sons had to make their own way by sword, by marriage, or by the church. Guy chose sword and marriage and arrived in the Holy Land sometime in the 1170s. There was nothing remarkable about his early years there. He was a knight with passable fighting skills, brave enough not to flee in battle, but not exceptional enough to be remembered for military talent. No notable strategic thinking, no particular diplomatic or administrative ability, no family connections strong enough to advance his career. But he arrived in the right place, at the right time, and met the right person. In 1180, Guy married Sibylla, sister of King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, and heir to the throne should Baldwin die without a child. This was one of the most controversial marriages in the history of the Crusader states. Baldwin IV, a capable ruler, though his body was being destroyed by leprosy, was not genuinely pleased with Guy. In 1183, he stripped Guy of the regency and governed himself despite being gravely ill, an extreme act that shows the depth of his frustration with his brother-in-law. The reason? In 1183, Guy had failed to exploit an important military opportunity against Saladin, leading his army to the point of confrontation and then withdrawing without engaging. This was not the cautious decision of a shrewd strategist. It was the hesitation of a man uncertain of himself and afraid of making a choice. When Baldwin IV died in May 1185, his will attempted to limit Guy's power. The throne passed to Sibylla's young son from her previous marriage, and if that boy died without an heir, succession was to be arbitrated by the popes and great kings of Europe, not to pass automatically to Guy. These were the clear precautions of a man who knew he was dying and was deeply anxious about his kingdom's future. Baldwin V, the child king, died in the summer of 1186, less than a year after taking the throne at around 8 or 9 years of age. Rather than following the international arbitration process stipulated in Baldwin IV's will, Sibylla and her supporters acted preemptively. Sibylla moved to Jerusalem and organized a coronation with the support of Patriarch Heraclius. Heraclius proposed that Sibylla could become legitimate queen if she divorced Guy and chose a more suitable husband. Sibylla agreed on the condition that she herself would choose her next husband. Once the divorce was formalized and Sibylla was crowned, she immediately declared she was choosing Guy of Lusignan again and placed a second crown on his head. This was a perfectly staged political performance. Those who opposed Guy, led by Raymond III of Tripoli and Bouillon of Ibelin, had no legal way to contest the outcome without openly rebelling against the legitimate queen. Guy of Lusignan became king of Jerusalem in 1186, not because he was highly regarded, not because he had demonstrated leadership ability, but because he had married the right person. And that person was politically skillful enough to place him on the throne despite all opposition. When Guy took the throne, the kingdom faced a threat without precedent. Saladin had unified most of the Muslim world surrounding Jerusalem under his control, holding Egypt to the south, Syria to the northeast, and a large portion of Mesopotamia. Jerusalem lay encircled and could only survive through exceptional leadership and internal unity. Both were absent. The kingdom was deeply divided. On one side, Guy and Sibylla, Patriarch Heraclius, and the newly arrived lords from Europe. On the other, Raymond III of Tripoli, Bouillon of Ibelin, and most of the Poulan nobility, those born and raised in the Holy Land, who understood that the kingdom's survival required wisdom in managing relations with neighboring Muslim powers. Guy lacked the ability to heal this division. He had insufficient personal authority to persuade the opposing faction and depended too heavily on those who had elevated him to act independently. In early July 1187, Saladin besieged Tiberias, where Raymond III's wife and family were staying. Guy convened a war council at Sepphoris, where the kingdom's entire military force had assembled. This was the most consequential meeting in the history of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The most practically sound argument came from Raymond III himself, the man with the greatest personal stake, since his wife was under siege. Raymond argued that the army should not march toward Tiberias. Sepphoris had water and was a strong defensive position. The road to Tiberias was more than 20 kilometers through dry, waterless hills, and Saladin's numerous cavalry could attack the marching column relentlessly. Raymond even stated plainly that he was willing to sacrifice his wife and his property at Tiberias if it meant the army was preserved. Other experienced lords, particularly Bouillon of Ibelin, agreed with Raymond. Guy initially agreed. That night, according to multiple sources, he had decided to keep the army at Sepphoris. But then Raynald de Châtillon came to him privately. What transpired between Guy and Raynald on the night of July 2nd was not directly recorded. We know only that the following morning, Guy ordered the entire army to break camp and march toward Tiberias. According to later chronicles, Raynald had berated Guy savagely over the decision to remain at Sepphoris, calling him a coward and arguing that military honor demanded action, that Saladin would not dare attack a full army on the march. That final argument was catastrophically wrong in strategic terms, and anyone who understood Saladin knew it to be wrong. But it struck Guy at his most vulnerable point, his fear of being regarded as a coward and unworthy of being king. On the morning of July 3rd, the army began to march. Raymond III, seeing what was unfolding, was recorded as saying, "We have already lost. This kingdom is dead." This is the part on which historians are in near complete agreement, as this is one of the most thoroughly documented battles of the 12th century. The army marched on the morning of July 3rd under the blazing Middle Eastern summer sun. Saladin's light cavalry immediately attacked both flanks and the rear guard, firing arrows continuously into the moving column. By the end of the day, the army had not covered even a third of the distance to Tiberias. The last water sources had been secured by Saladin's forces in advance. Men and horses, exhausted, parched, and starving, made camp on the dry hills inside a complete encirclement. That night, Saladin ordered the dry grass surrounding the crusader camp set ablaze. Smoke, heat, the beating of drums, and the shouting of Muslim soldiers filled the night without cease, allowing no one to sleep. On the morning of July 4th, the army resumed its march toward the Sea of Galilee, the glimmer of water visible in the distance but unreachable. Military discipline collapsed. The infantry broke formation and scrambled toward the hills called the Horns of Hattin. Raymond III led the cavalry in a single charge forward and broke through. According to some sources, Saladin's men deliberately opened a gap to isolate Guy. The rest of the army was completely surrounded. In the hours that followed, the entire Crusader force was annihilated or captured. Nearly 20,000 men were killed or taken prisoner. The entire elite knightly force of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was wiped out in a single day. The true cross was lost and never recovered. Guy of Lusignan was taken alive. News of Hattin spread like fire. With no army left to defend them and no morale left to resist, cities surrendered in rapid succession before Saladin even had to besiege them. Acre on July 10th, Nazareth on July 16th, Caesarea on July 29th, Jaffa on August 10th, Ascalon on September 4th. On September 20th, 1187, Saladin besieged Jerusalem. The city was defended by Bouillon of Ibelin with fewer than 14 knights and civilians bearing arms. After 2 weeks of desperate resistance, Bouillon negotiated surrender on October 2nd, 1187. From the time Godfrey de Bouillon seized Jerusalem in 1099 to the city's fall in 1187 was 88 years. Everyone who had lived, died, and been born in that city with the belief that it would forever remain part of the Christian world became a refugee, a slave, or a corpse within months of Hattin. The direct origin of all of that was the night of July 2nd, 1187, when Guy of Lusignan changed his mind. Saladin held Guy as an honorable prisoner for about a year. In 1188, he released him after Guy swore he would no longer fight against Saladin and would leave the Holy Land. What Guy did next is striking. He declared his oath invalid because it had been given under duress, and immediately returned to fighting Saladin. This act was widely condemned even by contemporary Christian lords, since breaking a sworn oath was the most serious violation of the knightly code of honor. When Sibylla died in 1190 during an epidemic, Guy lost the only legal basis for his claim to be king of Jerusalem. The right of succession passed to Isabel, Sibylla's half-sister. The nobility compelled Isabel to divorce her husband and marry Conrad of Montfort, who was held in far higher regard. Conrad was elected king of Jerusalem in 1192, and Guy was removed from the picture entirely. He ended his career in Cyprus, which Richard I of England sold to him in 1192. And in truth, Guy governed Cyprus considerably better than he had governed Jerusalem. The island was smaller, easier to manage, without the enormous strategic pressures. The Lusignan dynasty continued to rule Cyprus until 1489, nearly 300 years. Guy of Lusignan died in 1194. History tends to place the full burden of Hauteville on Guy. That is not wrong, but it obscures a more complex picture. Raynald de Châtillon arguably bears more direct responsibility for creating the conditions that led to Hauteville by breaking the truce agreements and forcing Saladin's hand. The political system of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, deeply divided and without effective mechanisms to resolve disputes, created the environment in which someone like Guy could ascend the throne and someone like Raynald could act without restraint. The Church, through its promises of indulgence and its sanctification of violence, created constant pressure toward aggressive action rather than caution. Guy bears ultimate responsibility because he was the one who made the decision, but he made it within a system that had been designed to fail, with the intellectual tools and judgment inadequate to the task he had taken on. Across the entire history of the Crusader states, no one caused greater destruction in a single decision than Guy of Lusignan on July 3, 1187. Not because he was evil, not because he wished to destroy the kingdom, but because he was a man without the capacity to lead who lacked the humility to recognize it, without the strength to refuse power when it was offered, and without the wisdom to listen to those who knew better, even when he knew that they knew better. Jerusalem fell in 1187 for many reasons, but if one must identify a single moment, a single decision, a single person, it is Guy of Lusignan on the night before Hauteville, when he chose to listen to the man who would flatter him rather than the man who would tell him the truth. That is the mistake that leaders in every age continue to make, and the consequences continue to be borne by everyone else. Chapter 10. Hugh de Lusignan and the Lords of Outremer. The 9 people on this list before him all had names. History remembers them for specific actions, specific battles, specific orders given in specific moments. This final chapter is different. It does not speak of one man with a dramatic story. It speaks of a system, of how the entire structure of the Crusader states was built on a foundation of exploitation, betrayal, and everyday violence. Not violence erupting in extreme moments, but institutionalized violence, regarded as normal, practiced daily by hundreds of lords whom history never bothered to name. Hugh de Lusignan, Guy's elder brother, represents that group of people. But the real story is larger than any single name. Outremer, Old French for beyond the sea, was the collective name for the Crusader states in the Holy Land, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Kingdom of Cyprus, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, and the County of Tripoli. For nearly 2 centuries, from 1098 until the fall of Acre in 1291, Outremer existed as a unique political and social entity in the midst of the Islamic world, a land in which Europeans ruled over a population that was predominantly Arab, Syrian, Armenian, and Jewish. This was medieval Europe's first large-scale colonial experiment, and it left lessons about power, exploitation, and collapse that are impossible not to recognize in a broader historical context. Hugh de Lusignan was one of hundreds of middling lords of Outremer, men who received land, collected taxes, adjudicated disputes, and administered small fiefdoms as they saw fit. He left no particular mark in major battles or significant political decisions. And that is precisely why he represents the most important thing to be said about Outremer. Not the dramatic moments, but the everyday reality. When Crusader lords occupied a territory, they did not destroy the population there. They needed that population to produce food, provide labor, and pay taxes. Arab and Syrian people continued to farm the same fields their ancestors had farmed, but now under an entirely different legal and economic system imposed by the Franks. A serf system in which indigenous peasants were bound to the land and required to render a significant portion of their output to their lord. Tax rates in the Crusader states were generally heavier than under the preceding Muslim dynasties. This is not an observation by modern historians wishing to idealize medieval Islamic society. It is recorded by the Crusader chroniclers themselves, who noticed that indigenous people often did not welcome the return of Crusader forces after periods of reconquest by Muslim powers. Ibn Jubair, an Andalusian Muslim scholar who traveled through the Holy Land in 1184, noted something remarkable. Muslim peasants in Frankish territory sometimes fled to Muslim-held land because the taxes were lighter, while peasants in Muslim territory sometimes sought to settle under Frankish rule because the Franks governed more predictably and adhered to agreed terms rather than being arbitrarily exploited by local officials. This picture is far more complex than either of the simplified versions history usually tells. But the systemic structure of Outremer was fundamentally one in which indigenous people were a subject class with limited rights, and the Franks were a ruling class with nearly unchecked authority within their own domains. When the Crusaders arrived, they found a native Christian population that had lived in these lands for centuries: Arab, Syrian, Armenian, and Greek Christians. In theory, the Crusaders came as liberators of these fellow believers. In practice, the reality was far more complicated. The Roman Catholic Church did not recognize the validity of Eastern Christian rites. When the Franks established the ecclesiastical system of Outremer, they imposed a Latin Catholic hierarchy over the existing one, and routinely marginalized or actively suppressed native Christian clergy and institutions. Indigenous Christians could not hold significant administrative or military positions. Their churches and monasteries were sometimes transferred to Catholic clergy arriving from Europe. Wilbrand of Oldenburg, a German cleric traveling through Outremer in the early 13th century, noted evident tension between Frankish Christians and native Christians, and observed that the indigenous population generally did not trust the Franks. Not for religious reasons, but because of their practical experience of how they were treated. If there is one consistent feature that stands out in the political history of Outremer, it is the relentless betrayal among allies. In Outremer, the consequences of such betrayals were catastrophically amplified by a simple reality. These were small territories surrounded by far larger powers, and unity was not a choice but a condition of survival. When that condition was disregarded in pursuit of personal advantage, the consequences were not a lord losing land or a family losing wealth. The consequences were thousands dead and tens of thousands enslaved. In 1148, during the Second Crusade, the lords of Outremer abruptly withdrew from a nearly successful campaign besieging Damascus, leaving the European army under King Louis VII of France and Emperor Conrad III of Germany bewildered and furious. Many historians argue that certain Outremer lords had commercial ties with Damascus and did not wish to see it conquered. The result? The European army left the Holy Land in profound bitterness and never organized another major coordinated campaign in that century. Damascus was subsequently taken by Nur ad-Din and became part of the unified Islamic empire that Saladin later inherited and expanded. Jocelyn III of Edessa is another example. He supported whichever faction promised the greatest personal benefit, regardless of the consequences for those around him. When Sibylla and Guy needed support to seize the throne in 1186, Jocelyn held the keys to the fortress of Acre and chose to back them, not because it was best for the kingdom, but because he calculated it was the most advantageous choice for himself. That decision was one of the direct factors leading to Châtillon and the fall of Jerusalem. No account of the Outremer system is complete without the Knights Templar, Knights Hospitaller, and Teutonic Knights. These orders were established to protect pilgrims and fight for the Holy Land, but over time they became independent power entities with their own properties, military forces, and interests that did not always align with those of the kingdom. In 1173 to 1174, Rashid ad-Din Sinan, the leader of the Ismaili assassins in Syria, sent envoys to King Amaury I of Jerusalem to discuss the possibility of his entire assassin community converting to Christianity, a potentially transformative strategic move that could have significantly altered the balance of power in the region. The envoy was assassinated on his return journey by a Templar knight. The suspected motive: the assassin's conversion would mean they would cease paying the regular tribute to the Templars for protection. Amaury I was furious and demanded the assassin be handed over for trial, but the Templars, exercising their legal autonomy, refused to surrender him for judgment. The strategic opportunity vanished, and the Templars continued collecting the assassin's tribute. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa provided the naval transport and supply networks without which Outremer could not have survived. In return, they received enormous economic privileges: the right to their own quarters in major cities, the right to trade tax-free, and the right to adjudicate their own disputes under their own laws. This system produced a paradox. The most important coastal cities of Outremer, Acre, Tyre, and Caesarea, were in practical terms semi-autonomous entities in which the Venetians, Genoese, and Pisans held authority nearly equal to the Frankish lords. In 1256, a war broke out in Acre between the Venetians and the Genoese, two cities that were in theory Christian allies of one another and of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The war lasted years and destroyed a significant portion of what remained of Outremer's most important city. Meanwhile, Mamluk Egypt was building the military power that would eventually sweep away the entire crusader presence in the Holy Land. Outremer officially ceased to exist on May 18, 1291, when Acre fell to the Mamluk army of Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil. In the final decades, the Frankish nobility continued to contest control of Acre by force. The Italian trading cities continued to defend their economic privileges at any cost, and the military orders continued to act in accordance with their institutional interests. None of those who held power were willing to place collective survival above personal or organizational advantage. The picture of Acre's final days is harrowing. Defenders fighting with desperate courage, knowing no relief army was coming. Women and children were carried onto ships while the Mamluks were breaking down the gates. The Templar headquarters held out for a few days after the rest of the city had fallen, before it collapsed under the weight of too many people sheltering inside. 2 centuries of Outremer ended not with a heroic last stand, but with a disintegration from within, completed by pressure from without. Hugh de Lusignan and the hundreds of other middling lords of Outremer are not remembered by history. No statues, no textbooks, no epic poems. But they were the ones who actually ran the system day by day. They collected taxes from indigenous peasants, managed prisoners in castle dungeons, made small decisions about who was allowed to pass through their territory and at what price, chose which allies to support or betray in the next dispute. The sum of all those small decisions produced systems whose consequences were anything but small. Outremer was the first and most clearly defined colonial experiment in European history. And what happened there is not a set of remote lessons from a world unrelated to the present. Those patterns, institutionalized exploitation, discrimination rationalized by ideology, the betrayal of allies for short-term gain, the refusal to place collective interest above personal interest, did not vanish with Outremer in 1291. They simply found new locations and new names. The 10 people on this list do not represent the whole of crusading history. There were people in that era who acted with considerable compassion and wisdom. There were knights who kept their word and found ways to coexist with those of different faiths and cultures. But these 10 represent a part of that story that cannot be set aside, the part that mainstream history tends to conceal behind the gilded surface of the crusading ideal. Their stories are not a reason to condemn an entire civilization or a religion. No one reading these pages bears personal responsibility for what happened at Béziers in 1209 or at Jerusalem in 1099. But all of us inherit a world shaped in part by those events. And the unavoidable truth is this: understanding history with honesty, including its darkest parts, is not an act of self-punishment. It is the prerequisite for not repeating those mistakes in new forms in new eras. These 10 knights were real people, living in real times, making real decisions with real consequences. The people who bore the consequences of those decisions were equally real. And that is all that history truly asks of us, to remember that everyone in that story was a real person.